Coming to you live from Addis Ababa, where the World Economic Forum is currently in session. Our focus for the next hour is the challenge when it comes to integrating markets on the African continent. I'm Bronwyn Nielsen from CNBC Africa. Let me take a moment to introduce to you my esteemed panelists. From my immediate right, I have Eleni Gabre-Madhin. She's the CEO of the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange. Next up, Pravin Gordhan. He's the Finance Minister of South Africa. We then have Erastus Mwencha. He's the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is the Coordinating Minister for Nigeria and, of course, the Minister of Finance in Nigeria. And then we are joined by John Rwangombwa. He's the Minister of Finance and Economic Planning of Rwanda. Thank you all very much for joining me for this broadcast. Ngozi, perhaps we can kick off with you. When we come to the biggest challenge of market integration on the continent, is it economic or political?
Well, thank you, Bronwyn, for picking me to be the first guinea pig. I think it's both. I think it's both political and economic, and one impacts on the other. Let me make a couple of points. On the political side, I actually think that our leaders on the continent are increasingly sharing the same political philosophy, that we need to support democracies, and that we need to be careful not to allow anti-democratic elements to take root on the continent again. And so you've seen successes with this. I think ECOWAS provides a good recent example, and they've had many successes, SADC to some extent. So we're moving, and the AU, of course, has been very active and good on this. But we still need a lot more to do on the political side, because I don't believe that political will is translating enough into improvements on the economic side. What do I mean? You need political will to do away with the many barriers that are stopping economic integration on the continent. Just taking one example, logistics. We all know that moving goods from one country to the other, transporting goods, is one of the most expensive businesses you can get into, because there's so many stops along the way from one country to the other and so many border checks. And each one is a costly one for the transporters. You need political will to do away with those and say, look, we're not going to have these barriers. Second, this is costly because you have a continent in which if we had good distribution systems and good logistics, we actually need not be hungry. You could move food from food surplus places on the continent, which we have, to food deficit. But right now, because of these barriers, we have a difficult problem doing that. Movement of people, I've talked of goods, the same thing. The visa issue has come up again and again during these discussions. And one of the first things that political will can do is to decide, as we have in ECOWAS, that for the whole continent, we can be visa-free and people can move around freely. I really believe that when you begin to do some of these things, then we can move into deeper integration issues. In the West African region, we're talking of a common currency. I still think we're some ways from doing this.
Ngozi, I'm going to interject there because I want to deal with each of these issues separately as we progress through the debate. So I'm going to throw it now to Pravin. And so in terms of our regional integration, if you look at the plays that Ngozi has mentioned, SADC and ECOWAS, we've also got the East African Community that comes into play, and the Maghreb Union. Which of those regional plays do you believe is the strongest at this time?
We're going to have a bit of a competition from Western Africa and Southern Africa. But I think that's not the important question. I think the fact that we have regional formations is an excellent foundation to have in place. The fact that there is an African consciousness developing as opposed to a country consciousness is a good start. But one of the challenges that we do have is how do we create a better recognition and balance between national interest and regional interest. It's the same debate we have in the G20 and elsewhere. How do we create a better balance between national interest and global interest? Now, what we've got to recognize is our limitations as Africa, which is 54 countries, many of them, 15 of them landlocked, many of them with very small economies and very small populations, and obviously the point that Ngozi made about the logistical deficiencies in our continent. What we want to look for, if we want to be global players, is how do we build scale? How do we integrate the best of what we have? How do we get the advantage of the demographic dividend more clearly coming into play? But above all, how do we dynamize the process between political decision-making and actual implementation? And the shortage is on the implementation side. And that's going to require a different kind of culture change amongst politicians, amongst bureaucrats, and amongst institutions on the African continent, all of which can be done if we recognize that there's an element of urgency around this and huge benefits for the continent as a whole if we set our minds on this.
Erastus, let's bring you in here. Perhaps if we look at, as Pravin said, it's not important who's the strongest. What I was trying to get there to was where can we take example from? Now, it's a well-known fact that ECOWAS is ahead of the game when it comes to the free movement of people, and perhaps SADC and the East African community lag on that front. If we look at that political will, how can we fast-track it? Do we need an overarching body, perhaps an African government for the continent? Is that the only way we're going to get to speak with one voice?
Thank you. I think it's important to understand the various models that are in play in the continent as far as regional integration is concerned. There is a set of countries that is putting more emphasis on what you may call political aspects of integration. There are those that put emphasis on economic. And this is not strange in the continent. This is also something that you see even globally. In the continent, there is this debate as a bottom-up and top-down. Should Africa, first of all, integrate at the level of the African Union, or should we have regional economic communities integrate and they become building blocks of the African Union? Now, this debate has been settled. Way back in 1963, it was agreed that we start with regional economic communities, and that's why they were called regional economic communities. But the political aspects would be taken up by the Union at the level of Africa. Now, what we have seen is a mixed bag. Now, coming to implementation, again, you see various scenarios of implementation. But if you look inside, a number of regional economic communities have made progress. I happen to come from a background of regional integration, so I can talk with authority as to what I have seen. I used to be Secretary General of COMESA. Before COMESA launched a free trade area, intra-regional trade in that area was just a paltry 1 billion. Today, it is 18 billion. And what has happened? The practical steps that Ngozi talked about, where you remove barriers to trade facilitation, information, helping customs to be less bureaucratic, getting the business communities together, getting the business communities to have a buy-in. These are small but very important steps that need to be taken so that you can have integration. And when you come to political, issues become more complicated because political, the sovereignty kick in, countries are always got this fear of losing the rights to protect and the flag. And so those are more long-term, and those can take time. But to benefit from what Pravin was talking, the economies of scale, the demographic dividend, let us get neighboring countries, like what we see in East African community, move faster, move into a free trade area, customs union, and then use this as a basis for launching the continental. So this January, if you followed, our debate was on boosting intra-African trade. And what we have agreed is to have a mix of these two. We'll get the regional economic communities to fast track so that they can move in those classic things of a free trade area, customs union. But at the continental level, we have also determined that we must move to a continental free trade area by 2017. And as Pravin says, issue is implementation and removing the fears and the perception that integration is a zero-sum game, and bridge the message. And I'm happy that these are all politicians I'm sharing the platform with, to bridge the message that is a win-win game.
John, isn't there room for consolidation on the regional front and also other bodies? For example, Rwanda. You're a member of the East African community. You're also a member of COMESA. Who ultimately do you take instruction from if you have conflicting policies? Let me put it to you that way. Or perhaps is it the African Union that you'll default to?
Yeah, thank you. I think as Erasmus said, there's no conflict. So being member of the two regional bodies is an advantage. It's not a disadvantage. The East African communities, a community of 5 countries, are maybe easier to agree and implement policies and reforms that can also impact on the bigger COMESA region of more than 20 countries. But also to note, which is important, linked to what, again, Erasmus said, starting from the EAC, the COMESA, and the SADC, now we are creating a platform that brings the 3 regional bodies together. So we are already working on integrating these 3 regional bodies for the benefit of the member states. So, but what I would say, I see bigger and quicker implementation of reforms within the smaller ESC community than maybe the bigger COMESA countries. For example, in COMESA, you have a PTA country, a free trade area. Some members are members of the FTA, others are not yet joined. But with the ESC, we are creating a common market. We are all members of the common market. We are creating a customs union. We are all members of the customs union. We've just agreed that we will be using identity cards for our citizens to move across the 5 member states. So that breaks all the barriers that were there for trade. We're already implementing single customs points where a trader moving from Uganda to Rwanda will only have their goods cleared or will have to face one set of customs officials not clearing from the Ugandan side and then coming to clear from the Rwandan side. So I can see quick implementation of this integration with the smaller community, but which is at the end of the day impacting on the bigger regional community. As I said, we are now working as 3 economic bodies that at the end of the day, as we are succeeding, we also impact on the whole continent.
Eleni, I want to touch on the commodity exchange in just a moment, but I want to throw it back to Pravin at this point. How far away are we from having something similar to a Schengen visa for Africa?
I think our Home Affairs ministers have been talking, certainly in the SADC context, quite a lot, and there's been arrangements arrived at which makes movement easier. But the key point is that we're not talking about something that is going to start sometime in the future. People are already, if you like, undertaking integration with their feet. Businesses in Africa are operating in multiple African countries. African professionals are operating outside of their normal turfs and migrating to other parts of Africa where they see opportunities. Our universities are actually exchanging academics. In South Africa, you have a large number of academics from other African countries as well. So this is work in progress, and I think what we're talking about here is how do you speed this up? And how does this actually begin to assume a gravitas that makes us important players on the global stage, and more importantly, the billion people on the African continent benefit from this. So I think in different places, as John was pointing out, you have customs regimes that are encouraging integration. You have the triple FTA, SADC, COMESA, and EAC. That's in progress. If we make the breakthroughs there through our trade ministers, we now have a market of 400 to 600 million people that's available, and the scale begins to tell in some ways. So I think what we need to do is to start looking at progress already made, successes already delivered, and ask ourselves, how do we speed up other processes so that we can build on that?
Well, talking about progress already made, successes already delivered, we've got to focus on the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange. Eleni, it started in 2008, in the spring of 2008, and you have managed to consolidate the agricultural environment within Ethiopia. Perhaps there's some lessons we can learn from you. And further, is there opportunity for a pan-African commodity exchange?
Thank you, Bron. I think that basically, when we talk about integrating markets, the fact is that on the ground, markets, particularly like around borders, short distances are already integrated because people are close enough that it's easier to go across the border than to go inland in a country. So in fact, the challenge is really to get long distance coordination of markets, even within countries, let alone across countries. So for us in Ethiopia, the first challenge was to enable anybody in Ethiopia to trade with anybody else, guaranteed of delivery, quantity, quality, and payment. And once you create that reliable supply chain, then really the rest is a matter of technology and expanding that same system out. So what I like to think is that it's not really, for me, a question about top down or bottom up. It's about aligning the right policies, the custom tariffs, etc., those policy regimes, the hard infrastructure, the roads, telecoms, etc., and then the very important part, which is our piece, which is the soft infrastructure. So the grades and standards. Can we speak the same language on product qualities? Can we harmonize clearing and payment systems? Can we enable market data and really using the power of technology? I mean, we can all trade on eBay from anywhere in the world. So it's extremely conceivable that we will all be able to use technology and institutional frameworks to develop a Pan-African market. But my view is, let's start by adding value where we are, expanding even within country a reliable domestic supply chain, and very quickly those reliable internal systems become interesting and usable for neighboring countries. It will be a very, I think, simple thing for Ethiopia and the East African coffee producers to link into a regional coffee index. An East African fine coffee index is something we can build relatively quickly when our neighbors speak with the same language, and we have harmonized some of our grades and standards on our markets and link our exchanges together. So this is my vision, is that in a sense it's a bottom-up that really brings all these pieces together.
Erasmus, coming back to you, the Minimum Implementation Program, or MIP, as it is known, is part of fast-tracking this integration process. You've got some key focus areas. Perhaps we can just highlight what is happening on the transport side. We've obviously got the Trans-Africa Highway on the agenda that's going to potentially link 26 countries, 590 million people. That's the direction we need to go in.
Yeah, thank you. Earlier on you asked a question about how do you get fast tracking. The minimum integration program, the name doesn't convey the actual intention of it, is what regional economic communities should be implementing at minimum and given dates so that they can be able to move towards convergence of forming the continental integration arrangement. And that has given in a number of areas. For instance, in the area of infrastructure, we now have a continental blueprint which has got a program of action that has also put in place a mechanism, both institutional, identified investment programs, and the corridors. Now, and also the architecture for mobilizing resources and implementation. The partnership between the regional economic communities and the African Union is a perfect fit in that. And where you talk of seeding some of the implementation activities at the national level through the principle of subsidiarity. We have similar programs, for instance, under CADEP, which is really shaping up to be a very important program, where again, as a continent, you come together and agree on the kind of minimum things that we should be doing. For instance, the arrangement to talk about, let each country try to invest about 10%, but then you identify national programs, regional programs, and the continental. Now, there are other issues like climate change, where
Erasmus, can I stay with the transport element here, and then we'll move on to all the other significant elements that we need to discuss. The Trans-Africa Highway, is that a reality?
It is a reality. In fact, if you look at, say, from what Cecil Rhodes had dreamed, from Cape to Cairo, there are now very few missing links for it to be finished. And the east-west, if you take, say, Mombasa to Dakar, there are also very few links to be finished. And there are a number of sub-corridors, like from North Africa to the ports in West Africa, and also In Eastern Africa, you have all these corridors. For instance, in Central Africa, all those programs are now being prepared to be bankable for implementation and bringing in not only African government, but also private investors and the international community to participate in them.
Ngozi, the West African transport situation, the West Africa highway, is that in the pipeline? Obviously, transport costs in Africa are among the highest in the world, especially when it comes to landlocked countries.
Yes, I think that the question of infrastructure, if we were able to get it right, would really unlock a lot of the integration issues that we're battling with. But let me say this. A lot of work has been done, and as Mwencha said, much progress has been made. But still, I want to point out one thing. I think we lack institutions that financially can borrow and implement. And we don't really have regional integration instruments. What am I saying? We have institutions that can package deals, that can do studies, that can prepare the way. But when it comes to implementation, we are lacking, if you had a regional institution, let's say, that could borrow on its own account, leverage financing on its own account, and implement as a regional organization a project, that would really help. And I think it would speed things up. Right now, what we do is each country does its segment, right? And we go back to the national thing to do that. And a country could decide that, look, this particular segment of the road is not my priority right now. It is better I do something else. So I think that for us to talk about a West African highway and, rail, don't forget rail as well, that we really need to devise this financing instrument that we can then use to apply. And I think it's vital to link the landlocked countries.
How far off, Pravin, are these financial institutions that can help with this integration?
Not too far off. We do have some of them in different forms. So you have the African Development Bank as one institution, but it's overloaded. It needs to get more capacity and more capital. We have the Development Bank of Southern Africa. I see there's an Ethiopian Development Bank. There'll be other institutions. But I think what Ngozi is saying is how do we leverage all of those to a completely new level? How do we get better project planning? How do we decentralize that in a way in which that planning capability and project preparation capability is available both to support the Africa-wide infrastructure but also national infrastructure as well? Then there's the financing element. New instruments need to be found. We, for example, are telling the World Bank it needs to think differently about how to finance African infrastructure, both in terms of scale and in terms of the kinds of instruments that they make available and the terms that they make them available on. So we there, if we could get the political and bureaucratic minds together, we could make some interesting strides, I think, in the next 2 or 3 years. But that deficit that Ngozi identifies is clearly there. Maybe if she did become president of the World Bank, it would have been easier to do some of these things, you see. By the way, that was an interesting example of African integration.
Yes.
100%.
We stood together as Africa behind her candidacy.
Yes, thank you.
John, while we're still on taking the best of what has happened and leveraging that for the rest of Africa, perhaps we can focus on the Northern Corridor, which has linked, obviously, Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, and it's linked you to Mombasa, the Kenyan seaport. That must have helped contribute to the fact that Rwanda is now the third most competitive economy to do business on the African continent, according to the World Economic Forum report 2011-2012, their competitiveness report.
Yeah, thank you. I think these corridors that link, especially us as the landlocked countries, are key to our economic development, also attracting investment. And what we are doing through this regional integration that we are talking about is really to ease transport along these corridors. It's not just an issue of investing in having a good road, but also investing in ensuring that there's smooth movement of traffic along these corridors. And that's what we are tackling as a region, removing all the non-tariff barriers that are along these routes. when we establish a single customs union, it makes it easier for goods transiting or coming from abroad. So from Mombasa to Kigali, it's like moving within one country, and all these barriers are removed. That's what we are working on. Maybe speak a bit on the earlier question you had asked about having institutions that can invest in this infrastructure as one institution. For example, we used to have the East African Railways in the former East African community. Today, maybe we might not need to establish this corporation. But we are working on a project with Tanzania and Burundi, on a railway project linking us to the port of Dar es Salaam. And what we are looking at is creating an investment vehicle under a PPP arrangement that will invest in this rail line and manage it as an investment opportunity. So it's not owned by Rwanda or Tanzania, but we are coming together to form an investment vehicle. The same with what we are doing with one of our power dams that we are investing in between us, Burundi and Congo. We are also setting up a private investment vehicle that's going to mobilize financing, invest in this power dam, and sell energy to our utility companies. So this is one of the mechanisms we can use to achieve or to implement these regional projects that need one entity to mobilize financing and manage these entities or these infrastructure and be able to pay back the financing.
Eleni, in terms of setting up the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange, what help did you have from financial institutions?
Well, I think that in our case, what we were able to use is external partners from the international financial institutions, so World Bank, UNDP, other agencies. But that doesn't really need to be the model in every country, and certainly not for something at a Pan-African level. I would imagine that there is now, and I would back up and say that in 2006 when our project started, there was enough doubt that a country like Ethiopia could even establish a commodity exchange and have it even become profitable, that really it would have been very difficult to mobilize financing on a commercial basis. But I think we've proven that this model is viable commercially. And so the context in which we would launch new exchanges, I think, is now quite different. And of course, the broader the scope of the market, the breadth of the participation across borders, then the more interesting it becomes for commercial financing. So my feeling and vision is that the exchanges that will emerge, and I think a wave of exchanges will be emerging in the coming 4 to 5 years, will be private-public partnerships with some level of government or regional body support, but also a good, healthy amount of private financing, which I think is now absolutely interesting.
You're watching the CNBC Africa broadcast coming to you live from Addis Ababa, where the World Economic Forum is currently in session. We're taking a short break. See you on the other side. We can stand down, you can breathe for 2 minutes, and then we're back into live broadcast format. To my panelists, are you all happy? For the next half, so I thought what we can do is focus on specifically, now we've spoken, what about the financial elements? So the building of this financial institution, the convertibility of currencies, those kind of things. I'll start with Ngozi on the convertibility of currencies, and we can take that from there, which means that we also move to freer trade, financing of trade, cross-border, those kind of things. Yeah. Yeah, okay. We've got 1 minute left. Okay, 45 seconds back.
But also Nigerians move across. I'm not sure what the net effect is.
It'll be interesting to see that.
You know, we have a huge country, so people come in and they just disappear inside. The number of Nigerians living in Nigeria, because they speak the same language, so how are you going to tell?
Welcome back to the CNBC Africa broadcast, coming to you live from Addis Ababa, where the World Economic Forum is currently in session. Our focus this afternoon is, of course, the challenge of market integration on the African continent. Ngozi, I'm coming back to you on this in terms of the convertibility of currencies on the African continent. Is that something that is in the pipeline and certainly on the horizon in the near future?
Well, I think that it's an aspiration we have, and beyond aspiration, I think we've been working towards it in the West African sub-region. But my belief is that in order to have this kind of convertibility, you really need to do quite a bit of work within countries. I mean, if you go to a common currency, and you have, by the way, you have among a group of West African countries, the CFA franc, you know, which is already convertible, traded, used, and it has its own issues, but I think it's one that we can at least see and savor the experience and learn from it. But moving towards a common convertible currency, I think requires strong economic actions behind borders. So I think until, you know, we are very sure in terms of our macroeconomic stability and some of the needed structural reforms that really underpin strong economies, you know, I think we should move, but move with caution and do all that is necessary. And you have seen what happens when in a common currency zone, as we're looking at the Eurozone now, when some members are not quite as strong as others, you know, or the statistics is not right. And then it becomes a contagion that spreads to the whole zone and can really have the debilitating economic impact. So I think we need to learn our lessons and take our time so that when and if we do that, we do it properly.
Pravin, do you agree with Ngozi on this front that we should hold back on the notion of a convertible currency for Africa?
Yes. In particular, you know, there's a live drama going on in front of us every single day called the euro. And there's lots of lessons, and that's an important historical experiment. Many years from now, we'll learn the lessons of what worked and what didn't work. On a mini scale, we have a rand monetary area, very similar to the West African situation, where there is this sharing of the rand. But far more important, perhaps, in our context would be trade financing. And doing trade financing in a way in which we could begin to use some of our own African currencies. Now, an interesting experiment amongst the BRICS countries is local currency trading. In this instance, using the renminbi if you're trading, for example, with China. Now, can we do more of that so that another problem that we also have in the globe, which is the problems that arise from a reserve currency like the dollar. And when that central bank decides they are going to do QE X, Y, and Z, it has significant impacts on other economies as well. But one country and one central bank can determine the fate of many parts of the world as a result of decisions that they actually make. So our world is transitioning in a million different ways to a different set of models. Hopefully most of us live to see some of those. But these things happen very gradually, and over time we'll learn where we make mistakes and where not to tread. And certainly Ngozi is right. This area, let's be treading very, very carefully.
John, before we move off the currency debate, what's happening in the East African community? Aren't you quite far down the track on this front?
Yeah, thank you. I think as my colleague said, we have this ambition of creating a monetary union with one currency. Of course, with the experience of Europe today, we are being a bit conscious on that. But what we are doing, there are other achievements or there are other added value we can have before even create this single currency. So we are integrating our financial markets, and so easier to trade across the region. Today, when we have an IPO in Kigali, a Tanzanian or a Kenyan or a Ugandan will subscribe to this IPO as a domestic investor, not as an international investor. But also the ease of doing business between investors in the two countries, creating the ease of transfer of resources. The fact that we have banks that are established across the region, that also eases trade across the region. So, in short, we had an ambitious target of establishing a monetary union this year, 2012. So we think it's not possible, but we've given ourselves a target that by the end of this year we'll have a protocol for the establishment of this monetary union with clear timelines of what has to be done, how we converge our economies, and how we strengthen the common market. As we strengthen the common market, as we have a fully functional customs union, then it will be easier to move to a monetary union. So we are on track, we are moving on that, but as I said, as my colleague said, we are a bit cautious and trying to create a homogeneous environment across the countries before we move on to a single currency.
Eleni, you want to add
I
there?
just want to jump. I'd like to just jump in on this point about the currency because, markets are very pragmatic. So if you've ever sat in a border market, and I spent a lot of my earlier career looking at border trade at borders, and what you see is next to the people going back and forth on bicycle between Uganda and Kenya or any other border, including many places I've been, you see also somebody with a wad of cash holding, some Ugandan shillings and Kenyan shillings and running a currency market. So I fully agree that maybe the first best world is to have one, humongous currency. But I don't think that's really the issue. The real issue is whether we can create those currency markets that that Pravin was talking about, that whether we can make it easy through regional banks or Pan-African banks to convert these currencies between countries, even maintaining our national currencies.
Ngozi, yes, you want to add, Erasmus?
Yeah, I think sequencing regional integration and getting your priorities right is very important. Going for a single currency is not something I would put as a front burner when it comes to regional integration. But there are issues that you need to address, because why you need single currency? You are essentially dealing with issue of convertibility, cost of doing business. Because at the moment, if you are doing business in Africa and you have a transaction between country A and B, confirmation of letters of credit takes place in New York or elsewhere. Now that costs money.
Yeah.
And it also affects trade. But there are schemes that you can use to overcome this challenge.
Exactly.
Things like payment schemes. And I know, for instance, in Eastern and Southern Africa, certainly under COMESA, they are now working on a payment. It used to be there, working very well. So currency convertibility is something you want to bring later on, as John and Ngozi and others have said. When you have economies that are disciplined, that are moving towards macroeconomic stability, that you can be sure that you don't have a serious problem of a contention that would develop. Now, in Europe at the moment, many people are saying it's not a euro crisis. It is really a problem of macroeconomic discipline at the national level, statistics and the rest, that is a problem. So I think we can throw out the baby with the bathwater, saying it is a currency problem, but the problem being at the national level.
Well, let's focus on this intra-Africa trade. Ngozi currently sitting at around 10%. At a push, if you include informal trade, cross-border, sitting at about 20%. Now that compares, and I know we don't want to benchmark against Europe with all its problems right now. I think that point has been made very clear this afternoon. But Europe's intertrade falls in at about 60%, North America at 40%, and you're sitting with Asia at around 30%. So we are seriously lagging right now. So what is it that we need? Is it this cross-border, or do we need trade finance institutions which focus specifically on regional trade on the African continent, on cross-border payment systems, all those kind of elements?
Yeah, well, you talked about both the formal level, where about, is it about 10%?
About 10%.
But informally, if we could really measure the huge amount of informal trade, because we lament a lot, but let me tell you, our people are far more integrated. Goods are moving all the time on the heads of people carried across when they can't get the lorry. And so I believe we should really study the cross-border informal flows. And if we had a way to measure them and to learn the lessons of how to enable this, we would be going somewhere. So I believe that trade is happening to a much larger extent. But it is important that it be formal, formalized if we can. At least those people supported, because as long as it's informal, they cannot have access to the proper means of financing to increase that and so on. Now, my strong belief is that for me, I would say the first thing that we need to look at is the logistics. If we can begin to solve the logistical problems and remove the numerous checkpoints along the road that you encounter, and even within our own borders, we also have national checkpoints, so we start with ourselves. Start with them, inculcate this mentality of being able to move and drive freely. That will really, the same way that the other day, as I was saying to Pravin, now we're going to Côte d'Ivoire. In the past, somebody joined our delegation at the last minute, literally. In the past, it could not have been possible because they didn't have a visa. This time, you could jump in, just take your passport and make it. When we make those corrections and goods can move, we can uptrade. The second more difficult problem is the nature of the commodities we trade. And the point is that most of us are selling the same commodities. We have no specialization in terms of what we do in our economies. So most of us grow the same things, we trade the same things, and so on and so forth. So one of the deeper things that I think we need to look at is there a way, looking at our comparative advantages, where we can, somehow be a little more specialized so that if a country is focusing on X crops, for instance, you grow everything, but maybe you do much more of one. In West Africa, I think everything that our neighbors can produce genuinely within their countries, we can absorb. We always say that. But, so if we had a bit more specialization, I think it would also encourage trade.
John, Erastus, you want to add there?
I wanted to jump in and largely agree with Ngozi, but deal with one aspect which I think is a perception. Personally, I've really been confronting, and she rightly mentioned that we lament a lot, and we also sometimes are skeptical for things that are not necessarily true. Now, there is a lot of complementarity in Africa, in the African economies, that is perhaps less talked about. Now, even if you talked about the agricultural commodities that we produce, and take each one of them, start even with tea. Now, one of the things, as I gave an example, in my previous incarnation, I realized, of course, that even, say, within COMESA, you could have huge trade in tea, but somebody would be thinking that in Africa, everybody produces tea, which is a kind of perception that is not true. Egypt doesn't produce tea, but perhaps Kenya produces tea, Sudan doesn't produce tea, but Kenya produces tea, and you can see that trade going on. And even if you took some of the commodities, say like maize, seasons alone, even within a country, you will find one season perhaps gets rain in January, another one in June. You can have seasonal trade, but also that's why you need mechanisms that can assist this trade. So it's not, to me, yes, you need to go to specialization, but the most important thing is what Ngozi said. how do we facilitate trade? And the facilitation also requires a paradigm shift in our mind. Our economies have always been thinking trade must be north-south, commodity must move north-south. If you look, our infrastructure is north-south, meaning port to inland. We need to change this and realize that if we have to benefit from the population dividend, there is a lot we can do in the continent, and these economies will grow faster the moment Africa starts to trade with itself, and that is certainly possible.
Pravin, perhaps one of the keys to that is communication. There's situations where we find some African countries are importing from outside the continent when actually one of their neighboring countries is producing that very good. If we had better communication flow, that could be a great starting point for us.
Well, in addition to the hard infrastructure, we now need soft infrastructure. So why can't we start focusing on developing African brands, developing better marketing, which is communications mechanisms on the continent? Why does tea from Kenya have to go somewhere else to be given a fancy brand and then bought at a spectacularly fancy price as well? So all of us in this world have become brand conscious. Now, can't we become brand conscious about African products and promote African brands? It'll throw up its own dynamics and challenges, I'm sure, but culturally we're still dominated by the perception that brands coming from particular geographies are the best in the world. I'm sure you can get best in the breed, best of breed from the African continent as well. So the soft infrastructure is going to be as important as the hard infrastructure as well. And again, it requires institutions, it requires the right level of cooperation. I've used this phrase elsewhere, let me use it again. We need a cooperative competition. We need to learn where to cooperate and we need to learn where to compete. Right now, we want to compete on everything and cooperate on very little, although we're making all these efforts. If we increase the cooperation part of that duo, there's huge dividends to be gained. And the flip side of this, of course, is that we need to create demand on the African continent. And demand on the African continent comes from jobs and comes from people having income in their pockets. So that dynamic has to flow together with the other dynamic that we're talking about in relation to integration as well.
Eleni, this softer touch point, made in Africa, buy in Africa.
Absolutely.
Are you forging ahead on the Ethiopian
Absolutely.
Commodity Exchange on that front?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's where we're all headed. But you know, the thing is that agreeing with what was said earlier about the logistics, very, very critical. But you know, where trade is happening, even the informal trade, it's because trade itself is promoting specialization. So it's not necessarily that we need specialization to have trade, but rather when you let trade happen, as it happens sometimes organically and informally, then you see that those who are less good at certain things shy away from it because there's an easier place they can get it. So I know, for example, that there's a lot of maize and beans from Ethiopia in Kenya. And that's because we have, seasonal surpluses and potentially more productivity in certain parts of the country. So it might be that we will be importing other goods, maybe industrialized goods or other manufactured things from Kenya while we are exporting the maize in the first instance, and then we'll see these things organically change. So I think get those borders open and let's focus on both the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure.
Ngozi.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise another issue that we should also be cognizant of. We have in the West Africa region the common external tariff, yes, which is actually very good, so we have a common book with some exceptions that allow us to protect some of the industries we want to encourage. And we've all signed up to this and are trying to do it. But we have certain challenges in this trade. Our promise is that if something is produced in a particular country, it can move freely at very low tariffs. But what we're seeing increasingly is goods produced elsewhere, brought in bulk, let's say palm oil from Malaysia, or typically textiles or goods from China. They are brought in, they are repackaged, and rebranded in a particular country, and then it's said that it is made there. Mm-hmm. And then it's brought into and it's a real challenge. Mm-hmm. So let us also look at some of the issues that are arising from this trade, because for us it's a very big problem and departs from the rule. And of course, our people and the other people are going into this breach and trying to exploit it. So if we are going to have this kind of trade and the freedom for our goods to move freely, it must be genuine intra-African trade, not goods made elsewhere that are just rebranded and sent across the border.
Yes. Let's bring in another theme here. While we're talking about hard and soft, do you think that we are moving from hard sovereignty to soft sovereignty on the African continent? And is that absolutely crucial when it comes to talking about the integration of this continent? John. Sorry, Ngozi. John and Erastus, if we can take up after that.
I think at the end of the day, when we talk of sovereignty, what does it mean? I think all, as governments and I'm sure as nationals of our countries, what's important is what benefits us in terms of improving our lives, in terms of improving our development. So fighting for sovereignty when you remain poor and you remain backward, I don't think that makes any sense. I think what we are doing, and I'm happy that we are here as officials from different governments talking as one, as all having interest to have Africa move as one continent. So when we think of that, I think the issue of sovereignty doesn't really matter here. At the end of the day, what do these borders mean anyway? When most of our borders are just artificial borders, because the citizens themselves who live across borders, they don't give value to this border. They visit each other, they intermarry, and so from the political side, when we start thinking like these citizens across our borders, and we just think what is beneficial to us as one continent, I think that's the most important thing. So sovereignty, yes, but sovereignty for what purpose? I think the most important thing is what do we need to do as a continent? Today we talk of global village, so why can't we talk of one continent as one village and do what is beneficial to us as one continent, not really as individual states, because we can't survive as individual states. It doesn't make sense at all.
Erasmus, let's get your African Union voice in on this one.
Integration is a process and it's a time-consuming because it's very slow. And when you look at the national level, a politician is got a short-term view because they have a next election to win. And that means aspects that may not deliver quickly will not be in the priority of the national dialogue or ex-country. But as John is saying, when we all start realizing that these borders, at the end of the day, make us less effective, and we see that pulling our sovereignty, rather than talking of losing it, but pulling it, makes us stronger. And that change, you can see starting to take root. And if you look at the aspects like peace and security, all countries now realize that we are talking of let's create an ECOMOG, let's create an African standby force. Now, who would be the commander? It's not the head of state. It will mean somebody else. That's sovereignty you are already setting. We are talking of creating an African court with jurisdiction to do some of the things that are done at the national level. That is ceding sovereignty. We are talking of a Pan-African parliament. Now, but the only thing, as I said, it is slow. But at the end of the day, when we realize, for instance, if we speak on climate change, go to the WTO. Pravin was talking about the African solidarity again behind Ngozi. If it was only Nigeria, nobody would listen. But if it was Africa, everybody was listening. And they know that Africa has made a statement. And so Africa, we need to work together. We need to talk together. That's when Africa will have a place on the global table.
Thank you, Erastus. Pravin, we haven't got much time left. We've got to talk about power and the pooling of power resources as part of keeping this continent going. SADC has been forging ahead on that front. What is happening? Is it working? And can it be deployed across the African continent?
I think there's some experts in the audience that are better qualified to talk about this. But yes, there's some progress, and there's been sort of power sharing. For example, Kahara Basa power coming into South Africa and other states. Today, Botswana is talking about coal-fired power stations in Botswana, where they could serve themselves and serve other states as well. The biggest hope for much of Africa is the Inga project. And that's the one that's been testing all of us. There's hope and huge potential in that project, but great hesitancy in moving forward for all sorts of reasons. And projects like that begin to test hard sovereignty and soft sovereignty. They begin to test whether, once you see an opportunity, there's the institutions and the legal and other frameworks which will enable us to capitalize on that. If we see some of those initiatives, it'll make a huge difference. But generally, I think there's a move towards an understanding that we require regional and continental power grids, that we can't do everything on a country-based basis, that power sharing in the electrical sense, not in the political sense, is going to be an important component of our collective survival. And we're all learning in different ways. We certainly are learning it in South Africa, that if you don't plan power sustainability on an adequate basis and on a 10, 20-year scenario, not through election cycles, we'll find ourselves in trouble. And those lessons, I think, are being borne in mind. What we require, though, is the right kind of utilities across the continent that then have, if you like, an African Union framework which will enable them to cooperate, to share, to make investment decisions on a planned basis, all of which I think can be done.
We've got 2 minutes before we close up on the broadcast, so perhaps I can quickly get you all to think. If I said to you that African integration has been put to the top of your agenda, John, you are in charge, and everybody in turn, what is the one thing that you are going to push very hard in the short term to achieve Africa market integration? John?
I think number one is infrastructure that links our countries, then breaking all these barriers along these corridors. I think that's very key. Thank you.
Ngozi?
Logistics.
Erastus?
Infrastructure trade.
Pravin, you're going to have to give me, everyone's hospital passes to you. You're going to give me at least 20 seconds, otherwise we're going to be ending this broadcast early.
No, it's an infrastructure linked to some practical successes. So, for example, the triple FTA. Let's make it work, and let's make it work sooner rather than later, and show that integration projects can actually succeed.
Eleni, you've got a whole 1 minute to cover in terms of if you were at the head of the Africa Integration Committee.
No, I think the first thing I would say is that we need to follow what is already being done and make that informal logic easier, facilitate it, enable it to grow, and foster it so that it really becomes the basis for scaling up. So, and to do that, it's about hard infrastructure, roads, logistics, transport fleets, but it's also about information flows, connecting people, grades and standards, financing across borders. So these kind of things, I think, will let that informal sector grow into something really exciting.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for my esteemed panelists. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Well, you've been watching a CNBC Africa broadcast coming to you live from Addis Ababa, where the World Economic Forum is currently in session. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you. Just very quickly, I know